Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, man.
And joining us once again, Luke Savage. Luke is a staff writer at Jacobin. His words are also a lot of other places. And he is the host of Michael and Us podcast and the author of the forthcoming book, The Dead Center. Luke Savage, welcome to the show.
Cheers. Good to be back.
So I have a few meta things I want to get into about being 90s kids, but let's get to business a little bit. And Dave wants to ask about a previous president, two previous presidents.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think yourself, like a lot of younger lefties, the Obama moment really showed, I think, both like the way that liberalism can be branded in an exciting way. But then also the immediate disappointment. And, you sort of note the role it played in your life. But for people who are still waiting to get their copy of your book, The Dead Center, could you sort of take us through sort of what Obama represented to you early on and then, the disappointments that followed that?
Sure. I mean, I don't think any liberal politician either before or since Obama has been able to replicate what you just described, which was the creation of, really like quite genuine excitement, not just in the United States, but internationally as well. I mean, there was that trip he did to Germany while still a candidate where there were like tens of thousands of people, maybe it was 100,000 people, I don't remember, came out to see him in Berlin, I think. And, I wasn't in the United States at the time. I was in my first year of undergrad at the University of Toronto. And the excitement about Obama was pretty much ubiquitous. I remember when CNN announced the result, when they projected that he won, people were literally streaming into the quad, crying and hugging each other. And of course, there were some American students there, but, a lot of that was just organic excitement about Obama because it really did seem like the stars were kind of aligned based on what all of us knew at the time about how, political change happens and what we thought we understood about Obama and what he was trying to do. It all seemed like the stars were aligned for, a pretty sweeping sort of, type of transformation of both American and international politics of the kind that really hadn't happened since, the mid 20th century or something like that. The scale of what we thought was going to happen was really that big. And so when not only did that not happen, but, it didn't happen because Obama clearly didn't actually, that wasn't his ultimate objective from the outset. He didn't actually care about doing that. And, if I'd been wiser at the time, I might have recognized that based on a lot of the things he was saying and writing. But, considering the scale of what we thought he was going to do and the scale of the, disappointment, I think that played a really major role in anchoring a lot of people on the left, because if you were part of that generation, that moment and everything that came after it really forced you to ask, well, if liberalism can't deliver the kind of change we need, what can?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a similar thing going on right now with maybe a freshman who in Biden's first administration. The difference being Trump didn't have 8 years like Bush did, which I think like really impacted, because I was a class of 2007 high school grad myself, and I remember the Obama winning was funny because I was in Fargo, North Dakota. And it was a little bit more mixed of the reactions to it. My roommate was a Bush supporter. But I remember like in any college town, pretty much anywhere, you're going to get, I think we felt like we were in the majority, us who were like loved Obama. And I liked Obama mainly because I had a sense that he was anti-war. And then I liked him on Jay Leno like 4 years earlier or something like that. Right. And that was like the extent I was plugged into politics. But like it was just like something to dunk on the people on our floor who were Republicans in between, like, playing Halo Land and, Guitar Hero and stuff like that.
No, the thing is, too, is that, like, Obama really showed the limitations of that perspective. I think people got like a crash course in it, in the sense of like, he had all this like political clay, right? Like they dominated, they had the Senate and the House. He wins overwhelmingly. There's a national crisis that's going on, which, certainly was, there's big portion of that goes to Bush, but like that's just like a system crisis too, the financial crisis. And then what does he do? He brings back all the same old boys, and plays the same game as all of his predecessors.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, it's important. You know, we're talking here about the impressions this made on people. You know, kind of, you know, people's personal political beliefs, but it's important, you know, to note here there were also, you know, pretty significant material consequences of the course Obama took, right? Because as you said, David, like this was a world historic crisis. This was, I suppose, until the recent COVID recession, this was the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression, and it came out of this. You know, it originated from, you know, this you know, lax regulatory structure in the U.S. housing market, and in the perverse way that the homes of so many working and middle class people had been turned into assets for these huge speculative financial firms. And, you know, even if people didn't understand the kind of nuts and bolts of how that worked, you know, subprime mortgages and all the rest of it, people intuitively did understand, and I think pretty broad way, what was at the root of this crisis. And Obama, you know, deciding to treat it like something that, you know, you could sort of just plug the holes, but you weren't going to, you know, transform the actual, you know, regulatory architecture or anything else that had led to this. You know, I mean, it was an extinction level event. I can't remember who used that phrase, but I mean, it was called, rightly, you know, an extinction level event for the Black middle class. I mean, huge numbers of people lost their homes, you know, a generation of middle class wealth just wiped out in the span of a few years. And, you know, I think if that hadn't happened, it's, among other things, pretty hard to imagine Donald Trump getting elected. But I mean, just this combination of you know, the huge hopes people had, people from all kinds of backgrounds and parts of, you know, the United States had for what they thought Obama was going to deliver, and then what ultimately happened. I mean, those two things, I think, are still having a profound impact on American politics and on global politics.
And like, I mean, like I talk about this a lot on this show too, that like, you know, a lot of times like leftists, because a lot of times when people like socialists are thinking about politics, at least in the US, they're really thinking about it in like the context of Bernie 16, Bernie 20, right? And the way that they think about politics a lot is like messaging. It was like, oh, if, you know, Bernie maybe had done like this or that, like his messaging was a little bit better, than we would have went over folks. And I don't necessarily think that's a wrong thing to wrestle with and deal with, but like, you know, our friend Ronan Burtonshaw at Tribune, when he was on our program a few years ago on TMBS, you know, had a line that really spoke to me. It's like, you know, our job as socialists is to convince people that politics can change their lives, right? That like it's a force for good. And like one thing I think a lot is sort of missed from the Obama analysis there is that like it's hard to convince a lot of people, especially older working class people who sort of like lived through the Obama years of like, you know, having that moment of excitement and maybe success that like, oh, look, we can do it. We can take power and then things will change. And then seeing, as we're alluding to, what ended up happening the 8 years later, you know, I mean, was that famous Obama line that he said privately, is like, you know, to a bunch of investment folks. I can't remember exactly what cohort he was speaking to, but he says, I'm the only thing that stands between you and the pitchforks right now. Yeah. Right. Like, you know, and that's how he saw his role at that kind of pivotal moment. And, you know, there's a lot of like rightful and understandable pessimism that a lot of people have about politics, I think directly falls out of like the Obama era sort of, you know, swindle, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure I really have anything to add to that, but I certainly agree.
I mean, what do you guys think about Obama's current? It seems like he's doubling down on that. Like, he's not going to learn anything or even fall back. He's going to continue that project, right? Like I heard recently he's upset that his administration was proposed as sort of a what not to do for Biden as far as like going small. And that's why you got like at least early indication that maybe Biden was going to do more than they wanted to. And Obama hated that. And he got, I mean, like, and I mean, any intervention he makes in politics to me seems to be bad and sort of like anti-small d democratic, frankly.
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that's clearly been guiding Obama more than anything else, I mean, I think his overriding objective since leaving the White House is preserving his legacy as a kind of world historic figure, even though he, you know, very visibly didn't change a lot about U.S. politics in the way people thought. I mean, you know, I'm sure he had deeper ideological objections to Bernie Sanders. Of course he would. But I think he also had or I think he had and has an investment, as that Biden story you just told clearly indicates. You know, he has an investment in always representing the outer edge of what is possible in, you know, liberal politics. Because if somebody goes beyond what he did, with all of his, you know, eloquence and communication skills and popularity, and his 60 votes in the Senate and majority in the House, et cetera, if somebody goes beyond that, or gets people excited and about some alternative to it, you know, he's no longer the great grandee of the Democratic Party. He's no longer the sort of the JFK FDR hybrid, or whatever he sees himself as. And, you know, he's, I think, made much more of an effort than a lot of ex-US presidents, really any other, to remain visible. You know, I mean, you know, George H.W. Bush, I think, started this tradition of just going out and just being totally cynical and speaking to, you know, banks and oil companies and getting paid, you know, $500,000 for a 30-minute speech about nothing. Obama's continued that, right? But he's also expanded, you know, the role of being an ex-president into all this strange stuff he does, where he kind of curates middle-brow lists of media for people, or rather, you know, his staff curate these lists that they're then sort of put out. You know, it really is a kind of Obama Inc., which I don't think anyone else has really tried before. And yeah, it's all deeply cynical. I mean, I think as he's left the White House, he's only become a more cynical figure. And of course, you know, the main defense of Obama that you usually hear is that, well, he wanted to do all this great stuff, but there were all these, you know, awful constraints. You know, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans wouldn't let him do, you know, the kinds of great things that he wanted to do. Well, he's out of the White House now. You know, he's not under any of those constraints. And, you know, if anything, I think he's only kind of moved, you know, rightward in his trajectory, and he's only grown kind of more cynical as a figure. You know, he's not out championing big important causes, right? He's making Netflix documentaries where he talks about how national parks are important. He's putting out lists of sort of middle-brow books and top 40 music you're supposed to, you know, consume. You know, he's hanging out with celebrities. You know, that's what he's doing.
Yeah, I honestly remember having discussions with folks back during the Obama administration where that now make me cringe, and I'm just remembering it, of people thinking, oh yeah, he's going to have an exciting post-presidency. And like, you can convince yourself based on like the Iran deal and maybe like thought of Cuba, like maybe he's just going to be unleashed. And it's like, not so much. And you do a good job of, I think, damning him for making idealism, I think you put it, like synonymous with platitudes or something like that. Like, because really, like, he was talking a big game about transformational change, and like, I mean, he really like sort of stretched out the sweater, if you will, or something.
I think he's somebody who's thought more deeply about rhetoric, you know, the enterprise of political rhetoric, than any other, you know, liberal politician, certainly in our lifetimes. I mean, in the book, I go into the essay on Obama, which is by far the longest essay in the book. I talk about how, you know, once you've read enough of him, once you've listened to enough of his speeches, you kind of realize that he has a move, like he has a shtick that he's doing over and over again. And it has I mean, it's tremendously effective rhetorically. He likes to set up, you know, these perceived oppositions between people, you know, ideological tendencies, big concepts, historical forces, whatever it is. And then he kind of gradually like whittles away through sort of a process of like dialectical opposition and kind of odd synthesis. He whittles away any distinction, right? This was the famous, you know, there's no red and blue America speech. So it's very effective, because what it does is it allows almost anybody to see their, you know, experience or their perspective reflected in Obama's, you know, in his self, in his image. And so it's kind of a mile wide and an inch deep in terms of all the kinds of things it captures. And that's, you know, far more effective, I think, than what most politicians do, right? Most politicians, especially liberal ones, you know, they're always trying to capture as big a, you know, they're always trying to speak in platitudes and be vague to capture as many people as possible. And by doing that, they actually demotivate a lot of people, right? Because hearing most people do that, it's pretty boring. Obama figured out a way to give that enterprise, which is just the same one that every hack, politician's been doing since time immemorial. He figured out a way to give that like this sweeping epochal character, such that you listening to it, if you were motivated by him and you were sympathetic to him, you felt like you were hearing this kind of grand sermon about the future. Although, of course you weren't.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just on this, because in a second I might want to talk about, the track record for like liberals in power. But, just so we're sort of operating from, the same kind of terminology. I mean, obviously it's a big subject, a lot of history, but, could you give people an understanding of what you sort of mean when we're talking about, liberals or liberalism at large?
Sure. I mean, I suppose there's a couple things I'd say about that. I mean, when I use those things in my book, they're mostly a shorthand for, what has been, I guess, the prevailing tendency in global politics since roughly the early 1990s, right? So when the Democratic Party is fully transformed by the Clintonites, when the British Labour Party is taken over by, Blair and Brown, and more broadly, I suppose, when the global order really shifts away from what had been the sort of prevailing direction of travel since 1945, when it shifts away from that into, what we now broadly call neoliberalism, where, everything is about the spread of markets, everything is about commodifying more and more parts of everyone's daily lives. Politics are increasingly kind of technocratic and managerial. There's more I could say on that, but that's broadly speaking what I usually mean. Although, of course, when we talk about liberalism, we're also talking about, a philosophical tradition that goes back to, the 17th century. And, that's talked about less in the book because, only got so many pages to work with. But I guess sometimes when I talk about liberalism, I'm referring to that as well.
Well, this might be a good occasion to play our clip of Bill Clinton here. And if you could, after set the table for what the context of Bill making this pronouncement was, which I mean, even before I was involved in paying attention to politics, I remember this as a quote that was trotted out.
I think I know what's coming.
We know big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem. We know and we have worked to give the American people a smaller, less bureaucratic government in Washington. And we have to give the American people one that lives within its means. The era of big government is over. But we cannot go back to the time when our citizens were left to fend for themselves.
Right. So, I mean, it's very emblematic of where the Democratic Party moved in the 1990s, right? They were no longer even pretending to be an alternative to, what Ronald Reagan had established. They were copying, they were taking the Republican Party's themes and kind of rhetoric about the role of the state, and they were just using it. They weren't just deferring to it; they were, embracing it. And that I think has been, particularly among American liberals, that has been the sort of basic move ever since. It's not just on the role of the state; it's on all kinds of things, which I guess are connected to the role of the state. I mean, tax policy, public spending, welfare programs, even, in the 90s, racial justice, which of course, Joe Biden was, or I should say racial injustice, in the 90s when, the big mass incarceration bill was, pushed quite actively by Joe Biden. I mean, that was also coming out of, moral panics, with, racist subtext or text, going back to at least the Nixon era and before. So, Clinton really perfected this type of triangulation, and in the process, he reoriented the Democratic Party away from some of the constituencies that had sustained it since the New Deal and towards this kind of more affluent, suburban constituency, which is increasingly, when Democratic politicians are talking, that's increasingly who they're addressing, and you can really, see that when you listen to them talk.
The funny thing about that era of big government quote is at the end of it, he says, but we can't return to the times where we let everybody fend for themselves. And like that little addition to that, it reminds me of like the West Wing sort of brain essay in your collection here, where it's like, first of all, like, no one's going to remember that because it's not what's going to happen. You're like making yourself feel good as if, and it's just like really cringeworthy, I think, after this line.
Right. I mean, so in copying Reaganism, he's also still like, he's also triangulating the other direction. He's saying, well, I mean, I just embraced Reaganism, but also I'm not really doing that. I mean, it's like, it's so, it's so transparently cynical. Actually, there's one other thing I'll say about that speech, because no one remembers another aspect of that speech. This is mentioned in a later essay in the book, but that speech where Clinton is proclaiming famously, the end of, we're getting government paternalism off your back, et cetera. He also, there's also a bit about, putting V chips in TV sets so that content will be made more wholesome for children. Mm-hmm. There's, he appeals to like Hollywood studio producers to make, programming, make movies and stuff that are more reflective of, I think, family values and, that kind of thing. So there's all this rhetoric about government paternalism, but, he was also copying the kind of, or, at least borrowing from the sort of repertoire of social conservatism from the Reagan era as well, right? Like all these kind of absurd panics from the 1980s about, started by, right-wing evangelicals, especially the so-called moral majority, about how, society was falling apart because of the stuff on TV, the stuff on the radio. So that's why we need to ban books. We need to, have V chips in our TV sets, all that kind of thing. So Clintonite triangulation was like pretty considerable, and it wasn't just around economic issues. It was around all kinds of things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dave and I were talking about that. Like, we're going to be it's the era of small government or something now. Except the government's going to get into the prison business to the extent that we're the largest cager of humans on planet Earth. But except for besides that, it's era of big government's over.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting bit of history, though, because I think that very much you can make the argument, I mean, rightfully, that this through Clinton and then Blair in the UK, that this is the triumphant moment of neoliberalism, right? And you see it across the board. This is this big movement for deregulation, destroying and waging war on the welfare state. While also relying extremely heavily on polling, right, and going whichever way the wind blows on things. That becomes very, very much, that's what Clinton's famous for more than anything. And the real irony of all of this has to be, there was all this triumphalism that you saw after this. And it still operates as a kind of common logic. And, this when you're sort of doing your media criticism in the book as well. That all this was sort of done under the promise that we're going to do this to basically ensure that this party stays in power and is the dominant party in American politics forever. And look, it's 2022. We've seen that hasn't actually been the case, that despite all of the favor, despite all of the opportunity, at least in the United States, for, the Democratic Party to basically become the party because of, social changes and things like that. The Republican Party has just sort of continued to thrive, frankly, despite, all of these, this sort of turning your back on the left and turning your back on labor. And this was supposed to allow you to sort of win forever, be able to maybe not do everything that y'all want, but, they can get enough done. That hasn't been the case. It hasn't been a very successful track record, even by their own kind of sales pitch.
I mean, it's crazy when you go back to the 1990s, just how kind of triumphant the rhetoric was, and just the whole culture at the time, across the board was consumed by this idea that, liberalism was going to be hegemonic basically forever, and that the kind of pattern of events that had been set into motion in 1989 was just going to continue, right? I mean. history itself was over, as the now like infamous phrase at the time proclaimed. And yeah, and as an extension of that, right, liberal parties were either going to be in power forever, or, the parties that occasionally kind of swapped governments with them would, have to operate within the, consensus they'd established. And like, not only did that not happen, right, but the actual consensus itself, basically, you could say to some extent, is ruptured by 9/11, but it really comes apart with the financial crisis, So, generously speaking, you can give it 10, maybe 15 years. It wasn't, it lasted far less than, Keynesianism did after the Second World War. It was hardly an impregnable kind of, way of organizing the world. And it's been prone to, increasingly since 2008, just constant implosions and disruptions, by design, because it's actually not a good way, just letting multinationals and finance kind of structure global politics and neutralizing democracy on both a national and international level. Guess what? That doesn't work very well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm curious what you think about this, because, I want to talk, you make a good note about like state level politics in your book, because a lot of the arguments, a lot of the counter arguments like, well, we have to deal with these Republicans, and the Republicans are anti-democracy, and we haven't always had like, the perfect experience to try this out. Right. Which again, I think, I don't know if I'd give that to them, but even if you give it to them, you have, a couple examples of states, New York and California, as examples of states that have been dominated by the Democratic Party. And like, you only have to look at those, as sort of models of like the failure of this worldview. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and also note something that Matt and I have been noticing. Like we called Biden the press release president at first, right? When everyone was getting really excited about Biden in his early days, because he would come out with a statement that, you then get these kind of like triumphant pieces, even from a lot of like, left liberals on that, like, we're in a new era because Biden acknowledged this, right? Biden would say climate change is like a race issue, right? And everyone's like, oh, Biden finally gets it. Well, then you actually look at what he's doing. He's very happy to acknowledge it. Cuomo, I like the note that you have about Cuomo and Newsom. When they're talking about climate change, they're just sort of like nice pleas from somebody that you might think is sort of like on the outside, say like, we need to do something, rather than people who are in control of very powerful and wealthy states.
Yeah, so that argument, which features in, I guess, a few places in the book, but there's an essay about Canada and what kind of it can teach us about liberals more generally, and or liberals around the world, but American liberals in particular. That essay was partly inspired by a great chapter in Thomas Frank's book Listen Liberal, which is called The Blue State Model. And he makes this point very persuasively, right? There are all these states that are liberal fortresses, and none of them are kind of Scandinavian social democracies, right? They're anything but. They have huge problems, not only with economic inequality. Some of them actually lead the United States in terms of material inequality. They have huge problems with racism, political corruption, police violence, you name it. And so liberals in those states are not using the power that they have, often in super majority power. They're not using it in the way that national Democrats claim, well, hey, we would use our power this way if we, if you'd give us the power. In fact, they often do the very opposite, right? Andrew Cuomo formed a special caucus so that he could pass Republican budgets in a state that was blue from top to bottom. So at a certain point, we really have to understand that liberals are not, it's not that they've suffered all these defeats and all this political retrenchment. And they would do all this great stuff if, they had enough votes, or if the country was just less politically conservative or whatever. Fundamentally, liberalism is a small c conservative project, at least in its, present day incarnation. If you go back to the, 19th century, the 18th century, it's had radical incarnations, right? In the United States, I suppose, one of the more radical periods is the one defined by FDR's kind of populist brand of liberalism. But none of that is anywhere to be found today, right? It's a managerial project. It's not trying to transform society, and insofar as it has any kind of wider conception of social justice, it's just about, as you were saying, you make statements, you make declarations, you appeal to things. It's all about language. It's about style. It's about aesthetics. It's about, how certain groups are represented within a structure that remains hierarchical and unjust. And, all of the arguments I think people still make in defense of liberalism to that end are belied by, what happens, what we've seen over and over again happens when liberals, have the authority, have the power, have the votes to do things. They still don't do it.
And I just, this critique means a lot to me, as a Texan, as someone, who lived most of my life in the South, because obviously look, Abbott and the people in control of this state are terrible. And we want to get rid of them, no doubt about it. But I get worried sometimes, just because it does feel like the deck is stacked against us, that there is this kind of, I don't know, tacit acknowledgement you get sometimes from Southern or red state or, lefties that what we need to do is create a period of Democratic Party, hegemony within these states. And then we can finally have the final conflict. And I'll just say that for the people who I love, that's, disastrous in the sense that we need to get healthcare for people. We need to make sure that people can stay in their homes. And two, as a thesis, it hasn't really borne out a lot of, the kind of rewards that are promised for people. And I think it would be a tremendous historical mistake if we were able to build up the, political power in places like Texas or South Carolina or wherever to overthrow the GOP that we just sort of replaced it with very milquetoast, coastal liberalism.
That's right. I mean, I feel like I've been hearing throughout my entire adult life, ever since I, got interested in politics as a teenager, some version of the argument that, you may not like it, but triangulating and sort of, pivoting to the center that's the savvy thing. That's the pragmatic thing, because, politics is the art of persuasion. You have to meet people where they are. And that means always meeting them, kind of a notch to the right of the center, and I've seen over and over again that, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in a kind of longer term way in terms of reversing the kind of wider trends we've been talking about, but it doesn't even work in a short-term electoral way because, triangulating doesn't motivate people. It doesn't give them a reason to be switched on to politics. And that's one of the reasons why, often what you have now is, political activism such as it exists in a mainstream way in the United States, right? It's just people who are kind of political junkies. They like watching cable news and they just cheer for one side or another. It is almost like sort of sports with infotainment thrown in. And so most people are not ever going to want to be involved in that kind of partisanship, right? To get people engaged, they have to feel like they're actually being represented and they have an interest that is central in some way to the project that they're a part of. And that you can't do that if you're if you wage politics, if you conduct politics in this really top down, heavily professionalized way where everything's focus grouped and politicians are always trying to communicate in sort of the vaguest and broadest way possible. It just doesn't work. And it especially doesn't work. And, Texas is certainly relevant here for the reasons you said. But it's, relevant more broadly as well, right? It doesn't work to stop the right. The whole claim is that this is what we have to do to stop, the right, which in Texas, especially with all, these bills lately is especially, terrifying. But at the end of the day, you can't beat that through triangulation. At least, once in a while, you might win an election, but it's not going to stop the overall trend. To do that, it requires, a richer political imagination and, a more kind of bottom up kind of strategy.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And again, the hyper focus on winning over fairly conservative suburban wealthy people is just not a strategy for the future.
Yeah.
I can't help but be reminded. Maybe we should talk about Beto here, David.
Yeah.
But it just reminds me of, like, in the face of GOP just restricting voting just to beat the band, they're saying we're going to out-organize that. It's just like, that's democracy is something that you have to, like, cultivate and protect, and not something that you can just sort of be like, oh, well, I guess that limb's been hacked off. We'll just figure it out. But let's talk about Beto a little bit before we move over to the Vision for Hart. How do you pronounce the name of that town? Hartlepool?
I think it's Hartlepool.
Hartlepool, right? Okay.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, you have a great piece in there about, like, Beto mania, and it is funny because I was saying to a couple of people earlier that, like, he's running for governor now, and there is, like, a retro element to his campaign, even though his, like, Senate campaign was only a couple of years ago, and, like, it's just he's a strange candidate because despite the way that he was presented, particularly in 2020, as, like, the young, maybe even more radical than Bernie Sanders, maybe, kind of character, he's shown himself to be somebody who really will go whichever way the wind blows. Like Title 42, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but, that's like a pretty racist rule that was put into the Trump administration to restrict immigration to this country. It's why they shut down the border here. Abbott shut down the border here in a big political stunt because they don't want to get rid of, their current ability to be able to turn people away, asylum seekers away at the border. And Beto, to his credit, had spent, the past couple of years being very critical about it. But then when the moment comes, when the rubber hits the road on it, he says, yeah, I think it's irresponsible actually to rescind Title 42, right? Which I don't know, if anything, like, that's a preview for what, like, a Beto, like, governorship or presidency would look like. I mean, could you talk a little bit about, what you sort of gathered from him in the 2020 campaign and the way that he was treated by the national media? Because I think it really does show, like, a fundamental disconnect of both, like, Democratic Party, like, leadership, but more strikingly, like, Democratic Party, like, media figures.
Oh yeah, I mean, they thought, and they still think, that the way to win an election and the way to succeed politically is just to dangle, shiny objects in front of people, shiny new personalities who can be these carte blanches onto which, people can project whatever. And they're kind of copying Obama in that, or they're trying to copy Obama and not succeeding, right? In 2020, they rolled out, I mean, just personality after personality, and, none of them caught fire. All of them were trying to be an Obama, right? And it didn't work, right? Kamala Harris invested her entire campaign in, not campaigning in early states and instead trying to have these viral debate moments. Like, it's all about, it's people who've watched too many, Jon Stewart owning, Fox News or whatever, or too many, Jed Bartlett owning, people in the West Wing with a single speech. And they think that that's a political strategy. And the O'Rourke campaign was especially notable in this sense because, it lasted about, I want to say 3 months, to be generous. Like, the window where anybody took seriously the idea that Beto O'Rourke was going to be the Democratic frontrunner in 2020 lasted from roughly, I think, the end of 2019 until, it was earlier than that, right? It was like the end of 2018 into 2019. Or I'm forgetting exactly when he dropped out, but by the time that famous Vanity Fair profile came out, like, his star, I feel like, was already kind of falling. He didn't have, the magic such as there had been any from his Senate campaign was not really translating. And it really did seem to think that, certain pundits and Democratic operatives thought that if they sort of just said that, well, this guy's the new Robert Kennedy, he's the new Obama, he's whatever, that was gonna catch on. And I mean, his candidacy turned out to be unbelievably awkward. I mean, like, just his weird slam poetry that he posted on Medium.
He's like standing on every table he could find.
Yeah, inexplicably, streaming his dental surgery that time. All this weird stuff. I mean, and if you reread that Vanity Fair profile, I mean, some of the passages are just cringeworthy beyond, words, like stuff about his being quintessentially Generation X and being raised on Star Wars and punk rock and a healthy suspicion of authority and, that kind of stuff. Just just painting, these broad kind of generalizations about this guy and his politics and what he represents based on just the most superficial observations about like the bookshelf in his house and stuff like that. And yeah, so I mean, Beto O'Rourke, I think, was an example of how invested a lot of liberals still are in this template, and also how unsuccessful it is unless you happen to have the unique political talents of Barack Obama or perhaps a Bill Clinton, which obviously, O'Rourke, Buttigieg, and others trying to copy this mold, definitely don't have.
I mean, it's been funny, like, just like because, I think you can imagine, but he really burned a lot of goodwill here. Yeah. When he ran for president, because people were like, if he seemed like he was going to be the kind of champion to push back against GOP dominance in the state of Texas, it was just, people felt very betrayed that the first thing he did was run as far away from Texas as possible to go campaign the country.
Well, right. And I mean, what did people actually like about Beto in 2019? I mean, I'm sure his appeal was, broader than the people that I saw on, Twitter and people I talked to. But it seemed to me that one of the big things that motivated excitement around him was the fact that people kind of thought that he had sort of Bernie-ish politics. There's a lot of, youth excitement in his campaign. There was this feeling that, he spoke kind of authentically and that he wasn't going to triangulate, in the face of a really loathsome opponent like Ted Cruz. He was actually going to, kind of stare the right in the face and, object on kind of, moral grounds to their arguments. And he just didn't do that at all. Like, what was Beto O'Rourke's Senate campaign about besides Beto ultimately, and what was his presidential campaign about? I guess the policy thing that if anyone remembers anything, people can recall, was where he just like brazenly was like, damn right, we're going to come to your house and take away all your guns, which I don't imagine, by the way, is serving him very well in the gubernatorial election.
Well, now he likes guns. Which has been pretty funny. So,
damn right, we're coming. Actually, he's like, damn right, we're coming for your guns, and we're going to take them out shooting.
I mean, like, and like to give him credit in his Senate run, he did something that I did respect, where he didn't just stay in like Democratic Party strongholds. He said, I'm going to go and visit every county. But again, like, while that's something the Democratic Party should just be comfortable with doing, like, as an intervention, like, it's actually not as like radical as like you would think, right?
Well, right, and visit every county to say what? I mean, like, yes. I don't remember what he was saying. He was driving around and like going up on tables and like saying God knows what. Like, I don't think he wasn't going to every county and like spreading the gospel of like, universal health care or anything like that.